The Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. Chapter 6. An old-fashioned card party, the clergyman's verses, and the story of the convict's return. Several guests who were assembled in the old parlour rose to greet Mr. Pickwick and his friends upon their entrance, and during the performance of the ceremony of introduction, with all due formalities, Mr. Pickwick had leisure to observe the appearance and speculate upon the characters and pursuits of the persons by whom he was surrounded, a habit in which he, in common with many other great men, delighted to indulge. A very old lady in a lofty cap and faded silk gown, no less a personage than Mr. Wardle's mother, occupied the post of honour on the right-hand corner of the chimney-piece, and various certificates of her having been brought up in the way she should go when young, and of her not having departed from it when old, ornamented the walls in the form of samplers of ancient date, worsted landscapes of equal antiquity, and crimson silk tea-kettle holders of a more modern period. The aunt, the two young ladies, and Mr. Wardle, each vying with the other in paying zealous and unremitting attentions to the old lady, crowded round her easy chair, one holding her ear trumpet, another an orange, and a third a smelling bottle, while a fourth was busily engaged in patting and punching the pillows which were arranged for her support. On the opposite side sat a bald-headed old gentleman, with a good-humoured, benevolent face, the clergyman of Dingley Dell, and next to him sat his wife, a stout, blooming old lady, who looked as if she were well skilled, not only in the art and mystery of manufacturing home-made cordials, greatly to other people's satisfaction, but of tasting them occasionally very much to her own. A little hard-headed, Ribston-Pippin-faced man was conversing with the fat old gentleman in one corner, and 2 or 3 more old gentlemen and 2 or 3 more old ladies sat bolt upright and motionless on their chairs, staring very hard at Mr. Pickwick and his fellow voyagers. "Mr. Pickwick, mother!" said Mr. Wardle at the very top of his voice. Said the old lady, shaking her head. "I can't hear you." "Mr. Pickwick, Grandma!" screamed both the young ladies together. Exclaimed the old lady. "Well, it don't much matter. He don't care for an old woman like me, I dare say." "I assure you, ma'am," said Mr. Pickwick, grasping the old lady's hand, and speaking so loud that the exertion imparted a crimson hue to his benevolent countenance, "I assure you, ma'am, that nothing delights me more than to see a lady of your time of life heading so fine a family and looking so young and well." Said the old lady, after a short pause. "It's all very fine, I dare say, but I can't hear him." "Grandma's rather put out now," said Miss Isabella Wardle in a low tone, "but she'll talk to you presently." Mr. Pickwick nodded his readiness to humour the infirmities of age, and entered into a general conversation with the other members of the circle. "Delightful situation, this," said Mr. Pickwick. "Delightful," echoed Messrs. Snodgrass, Tupman, and Winkle. "Well, I think it is," said Mr. Wardle. "Well, there ain't a better spot in the ground in all Kent, sir," said the hard-headed man with a piffin face. "There ain't indeed, sir. I'm sure there ain't, sir." The hard-headed man looked triumphantly around, as if he had been very much contradicted by somebody, but had got the better of him at last. "There ain't a better spot in all of Kent," said the hard-headed man again, after a pause. "'Cept Mullins Meadows," observed the fat man solemnly. "Mullins Meadows!" ejaculated the other with profound contempt. "Ah, Mullins Meadows," repeated the fat man. "Regular good land, that," interposed another fat man. "And so it is, surely," said a third fat man. "Everybody knows that," said the corpulent host. The hard-headed man looked dubiously around, but finding himself in a minority, assumed a compassionate air and said no more. "What are they talking about?" inquired the old lady of one of her granddaughters in a very audible voice, for, like many deaf people, she never seemed to calculate on the possibility of other persons hearing what she said herself. "About the land, Grandma." "What about the land? Nothing the matter, is there?" No. Mr. Miller was saying our land was better than Mullins Meadows." "Then how would he know anything about it?" inquired the old lady indignantly. "Miller's a conceited coxcomb, and you may tell him that I said so." Saying which, the old lady, quite unconscious that she had spoken above a whisper, drew herself up and looked carving knives at the hard-headed delinquent. "Come, come," said the bustling host, with a natural anxiety to change the conversation. "What say you to rubber, Mr. Pickwick?" "I should like it of all things," replied the gentleman, "but pray don't make one up on my account." "Oh, I assure you, mother, I'm very fond of rubber," said Mr. Wardle. "I am your mother." The old lady, who was much less deaf on this subject than on any other, replied in the affirmative. "Joe! Joe!" said the old gentleman. "Joe! Damn that! Oh, here he is. Put out the card tables." The lethargic youth contrived without any additional rousing to set out 2 card tables, the one for Pope Joan and the other for whist. The whist players were Mr. Pickwick and the old lady, Mr. Miller and the fat gentleman. The round game comprised the rest of the company. The rubber was conducted with all that gravity of deportment and sedateness of demeanour which befit the pursuit entitled whist, a solemn observance to which, as it appears to us, the title of game has been very irreverently and ignominiously applied. The round game table, on the other hand, was so boisterously merry as materially to interrupt the contemplations of Mr. Miller, who, not being quite as much absorbed as he ought to have been, contrived to commit various high crimes and misdemeanours, which excited the wrath of the fat gentleman to a very great extent, and called forth the good humour of the old lady to a proportionate degree. "There!" said the criminal Miller triumphantly, as he took up the odd trick at the conclusion of a hand. "That could not have been played better, I flatter myself. Impossible to have made another trick." "Miller ought to have trumped the diamond, oughtn't he, sir?" said the old lady. Mr. Pickwick nodded assent. "Ought I, though?" said the unfortunate, with a doubtful appeal to his partner. "You ought, sir," said the fat gentleman in an awful voice. "Very sorry," said the crestfallen Miller. "Much use that," growled the fat gentleman. "2 by honours makes us 8, said Mr. Pickwick. "Another hand, can you one?" inquired the old lady. "I can," replied Mr. Pickwick. "Double, single, and the rub." "Never was such luck," said Mr. Miller. "Never was such cards," said the fat gentleman. A solemn silence. Mr. Pickwick humorous, the old lady serious, the fat gentleman captious, and Mr. Miller timorous. "Another double," said the old lady, triumphantly making a memorandum of the circumstances by placing 1 sixpence and a battered halfpenny under the candlestick. "A double, sir," said Mr. Pickwick. "Quite aware of the fact, sir," replied the fat gentleman sharply. Another game with a similar result was followed by a revoke from the unlucky Miller, on which the fat gentleman burst into a state of high personal excitement which lasted until the conclusion of the game, when he retired into a corner and remained perfectly mute for 1 hour and 27 minutes, at the end of which time he emerged from his retirement and offered Mr. Pickwick a pinch of snuff with the air of a man who had made up his mind to a Christian forgiveness of injuries sustained. The old lady's hearing decidedly improved, and the unlucky Miller felt as much out of his element as a dolphin in a sentry box. Meanwhile, the round game proceeded right merrily. Isabella Wardle and Mr. Trundle went partners, and Emily Wardle and Mr. Snodgrass did the same, and even Mr. Tupman and the spinster aunt established a joint stock company of fish and flattery. Old Mr. Wardle was in the very height of his jollity, and he was so funny in his management of the board, and the old ladies were so sharp after their winnings, that the whole table was in perpetual roar of merriment and laughter. There was one old lady who always had about 6 cards to pay for, at which everybody laughed regularly every round, and when the old lady looked cross at having to pay, they laughed louder than ever, on which the old lady's face gradually brightened up, till at last she laughed louder than any of them. Then, when the spinster aunt got matrimony, the young ladies laughed afresh, and the spinster aunt seemed disposed to be pettish, till, feeling Mr. Tupman squeezing her hand under the table, she brightened up too, and looked rather knowing, as if matrimony in reality were not quite so far off as some people thought for, whereupon everybody laughed again, and especially old Mr. Wardle, who enjoyed a joke as much as the youngest. As to Mr. Snodgrass, he did nothing but whisper poetical sentiments into his partner's ear, which made one old gentleman facetiously sly about partnerships at cards and partnerships for life, and caused the aforesaid old gentleman to make some remarks thereupon, accompanied with divers winks and chuckles, which made the company very merry, and the old gentleman's wife especially so. Mr. Winkle came out with jokes which were very well known in town, but not at all known in the country, and as everybody laughed at them very heartily and said they were very capital, Mr. Winkle was in a state of great honour and glory, and the benevolent clergyman looked pleasantly on, though the happy faces which surrounded the table made the good old man feel happy too. And though the merriment was rather boisterous, still it came from the heart and not from the lips, and this is the right sort of merriment after all. The evening glided swiftly away in those cheerful recreations, and when the substantial though homely supper had been dispatched, and the little party formed a social circle round the fire, Mr. Pickwick thought he had never felt so happy in his life, and at no time so much disposed to enjoy, and make the most of, the passing moment. "Now this," said the hospitable host, who was sitting in great state next the old lady's armchair, with her hand fast clasped in his, "this is just what I like. The happiest moments of my life have been passed at this old fireside, and I am so attached to it. I keep up a blazing fire here every evening, until it actually grows too hot to bear it. Why, my poor old mother here used to sit before this fireplace upon that little stool when she was a girl, didn't you, mother?" The tear which starts unbidden to the eye when the recollection of old times and the happiness of many years ago is suddenly recalled stole down the old lady's face as she shook her head with a melancholy smile. "You must excuse me talking about this old place, Mr. Pickwick," resumed the host, after a short pause, "for I love it dearly, and I know no other. The old houses and fields seem like living friends to me, and so does our little church with the ivy, about which, by the by, our excellent friend here made a song when he first came amongst us. Mr. Snodgrass, have you anything in your glass?" "Plenty, thank you," replied that gentleman, whose poetic curiosity had been greatly excited by the last observations of his entertainer. "I beg your pardon, but you were talking about the Song of the Ivy." "You must ask our friend opposite about that," said the host, knowingly, indicating the clergyman by a nod of his head. "May I say that I should like to hear you repeated, sir?" said Mr. Snodgrass. "Why, really," replied the clergyman, "it's a very slight affair, and the only excuse I have for ever having perpetrated is that I was a young man at the time. Such as it is, however, you shall hear it if you wish." A murmur of curiosity was of course the reply, and the old gentleman proceeded to recite, with the aid of sundry promptings from his wife, the lines in question. "I call them," said he, "the ivy green. Oh, a dainty plant is the ivy green, that creepeth over ruins old. Of right choice food are his meals, I ween, in his cell so lone and cold. The wall must be crumbled, the stone decayed, to pleasure his dainty whim, and the mouldering dust that years have made is a merry meal for him. Creeping where no life is seen, a rare old plant is the ivy green. Fast he stealeth on, though he wears no wings, and a staunch old heart has he. How closely he twineth, how tight he clings to his friend the huge oak tree, and slyly he traileth along the ground, and his leaves he gently waves, as he joyously hugs and calleth round the rich mould of dead men's graves. Creeping where grim death has been, a rare old plant is the ivy green. Whole ages have fled and their words decayed, and nations have scattered been. but the stout old ivy shall never fade from its hale and hearty green. The brave old plant in its lonely days shall fatten upon the past, for the stateliest building man can raise is the ivy's fruit at last. Creeping on where time has been, a rare old plant is the ivy green. While the old gentleman repeated these lines a second time, to enable Mr. Snodgrass to note them down, Mr. Pickwick perused the lineaments of his face with an expression of great interest. The old gentleman having concluded his dictation, and Mr. Snodgrass having returned his notebook to his pocket, Mr. Pickwick said, "Excuse me, sir, for making the remark on so short an acquaintance, but a gentleman like yourself cannot fail, I should think, to have observed many scenes and incidents as worth recording in the course of your experience as a minister of the gospel." "I have witnessed some, certainly," replied the old gentleman, "but the incidents and characters have been of a homely and ordinary nature, my sphere of action being so very limited." "You did make some notes, I think, about John Edmonds, did you not?" inquired Mr. Wardle, who appeared very desirous to draw his friend out for the edification of his new visitors. The old gentleman slightly nodded his head in token of assent, and was proceeding to change the subject when Mr. Pickwick said, "I beg your pardon, sir, but pray, if I may venture to inquire, who was John Edmonds?" "The very thing I was about to ask," said Mr. Snodgrass eagerly. "You fairly in for it," said the jolly host. "You must satisfy the curiosity of these gentlemen sooner or later, so you'd better take advantage of this favourable opportunity, and do so at once." The old gentleman smiled good-humouredly as he drew his chair forward. The remainder of the party drew theirs closer together, especially Mr. Tupman and the spinster aunt, who were possibly rather hard of hearing, and the old lady's ear-trumpet having been duly adjusted, and Mr. Miller, who had fallen asleep during the recital of the verses, roused from his slumbers by an admonitory pinch administered beneath the table by his ex-partner, the solemn fat man, the old gentleman, without further preface, commenced the following tale, to which we have taken the liberty of prefixing the title of The Convict's Return. "When I first settled in this village," said the old gentleman, "which is now just 25 years ago, the most notorious person among my parishioners was a man of the name of Edmonds, who leased a small farm near this spot. He was a morose, savage-hearted, bad man, idle and dissolute in his habits, cruel and ferocious in his disposition. Beyond a few lazy and reckless vagabonds with whom he sauntered away his time in the fields or sotted in the alehouse, he had not a single friend or acquaintance. No one dared speak to the man whom many feared and every one detested, and Edmonds was shunned by all. This man had a wife and one son, who, when I first came here, was about 12 years old. Of the acuteness of that woman's sufferings, of the gentle and enduring manner in which she bore them, of the agony of solicitude with which she reared that boy, no one could form an adequate conception. Heaven forgive me the supposition, if it be an uncharitable one, but I do firmly and in my soul believe that the man systematically tried for many years to break her heart, but she bore it all for her child's sake, and however strange it may seem to many, for his father's too, for brute as he was, and cruelly as he treated her, she had loved him once, and the recollection of which had been to her awakened feelings of forbearance and meekness under suffering in her bosom, to which all God's creatures but women are strangers. They were poor. It could not be otherwise when the man pursued such courses, but the woman's unceasing and unwearied exertions, early and late, morning, noon, and night, kept them above actual want. Those exertions were but ill repaid. People passed the spot in the evening,
sometimes at a late hour of the night, reported that they had heard the moans and sobs of a woman in distress, and the sound of blows more than once. When it was past midnight, the boy knocked softly at the door of a neighbour's house, whither he had been sent to escape the drunken fury of his unnatural father. During the whole of this time, when the poor creature often bore about her marks of ill usage and violence, which she could not wholly conceal, she was a constant attendant at our little church. Regularly every Sunday and Monday, morning and afternoon, she occupied the same seat with the boy at her side, and though they were both poorly dressed, much more so than many of their neighbours who were in a lower station, they were always neat and clean. Everybody had a friendly nod and a kind word for poor Mrs. Edmonds, and sometimes when she stopped to exchange a few words with a neighbour at the conclusion of the service in the little row of elm trees which leads to the church porch, or lingered behind to gaze with a mother's pride and fondness upon her healthy boy as he sported before her with some little companions, her careworn face would lighten up with an expression of heartfelt gratitude, and she would look, if not cheerful and happy, at least tranquil and contented. 5 or 6 years passed away. The boy had become a robust and well-grown youth. The time that had strengthened the child's light frame and knit his weak limbs into the strength of manhood had bowed his mother's form and enfeebled her steps, but the arm that should have supported her was no longer locked in hers. The face that should have cheered her no more looked upon her own. She occupied her old seat, but there was a vacant one beside her. The Bible was kept as carefully as ever. The places were found and folded down as they used to be, but there was no one to read it with her. The tears fell thick and fast upon the book, and blotted the words from her eyes. Neighbours were kind, as they were wont to be of old, but she shunned their greetings with averted head. There was no lingering among the old elm trees now, no cheering anticipations of happiness yet in store. The desolate woman drew her bonnet closer over her face and walked hurriedly away. Shall I tell you that the young man, who, looking back to the earliest of his childhood days, to which memory and consciousness extended, and carrying his recollection down to that moment, could remember nothing which was not in some way connected with a long series of voluntary privations suffered by his mother for his sake, with ill usage and insult and violence, and all endured for him? Shall I tell you that he, with a reckless disregard of her breaking heart and a sudden wilful forgetfulness of all she had done and borne for him, had linked himself with depraved and abandoned men, and was madly pursuing a headlong career which must bring death to him, and shame to her? Alas for human nature! You have anticipated it long since. The measure of the unhappy woman's misery and misfortune was about to be completed. Numerous offences had been committed in the neighbourhood. The perpetrators remained undiscovered, and their boldness increased. A robbery of a daring and aggravated nature occasioned a vigilance of pursuit and a strictness of search they had not calculated on. Young Edmonds was suspected with 3 companions. He was apprehended, committed, tried, and condemned to die. The wild and piercing shriek from a woman's voice, which resounded through the court when the solemn sentence was pronounced, rings in my ears at this moment. That cry struck a terror to the culprit's heart, which trial, condemnation, the approach of death itself, had failed to waken. The lips, which had been compressed in dogged sullenness throughout, quivered and parted involuntarily. The face turned ashy pale as the cold perspiration broke forth from every pore. The sturdy limbs of the felon trembled, and he staggered into the dock. In the first transports of her mental anguish, the suffering mother threw herself upon her knees at my feet, and fervently besought the almighty being who had hitherto supported her in all her troubles to release her from a world of woe and misery, and to spare the life of her only child. A burst of grief and a violent struggle, such as I hope I may never have to witness again, succeeded. I knew that her heart was breaking from that hour, but never once heard complaint or murmur escape from her lips. It was a piteous spectacle to see that woman in the prison yard from day to day, eagerly and fervently attempting by affection and entreaty to soften the hard heart of an obdurate son. It was in vain. He remained moody, obstinate, and unmoved. Not even the unlooked-for commutation of his sentence to transportation for 14 years softened for an instant the sullen hardihood of his demeanour. But the spirit of resignation and endurance that had so long upheld her was unable to contend against bodily weakness and infirmity. She fell sick. She dragged her tottering limbs from the bed to visit her son once more. But her strength failed her, and she sunk powerless on the ground. And now the boasted coldness and indifference of the old man were tested indeed, and the retribution that fell heavily upon him nearly drove him mad. A day passed away, and his mother was not there. Another flew by, and she came not near him. A third evening arrived, and yet he had not seen her. And in 24 hours he was to be separated from her, perhaps forever. Oh, how the long-forgotten thoughts of former days rushed upon his mind as he almost ran up and down the narrow yard, as if intelligence would arrive the sooner for his hurrying, and how bitterly a sense of his helplessness and desolation rushed upon him when he heard the truth. His mother, the only parent he had ever known, lay ill. It might be dying, within 1 mile of the ground he stood on. Were he free and unfettered, a few minutes would place him by her side. He rushed to the gate, and grasping the iron rails with the energy of desperation, shook it till it rung again, and threw himself against the thick wall as if to force a passage through the stone. But the strong building mocked his feeble efforts, and he beat his hands together and wept like a child. I bore the mother's forgiveness and blessing to her son in prison, and I carried his solemn assurance of repentance, and his fervent supplication for pardon to her sick bed. I heard with pity and compassion the repentant man devise 1,000 little plans